When do you start to realise you weren't his only victim?
I saw the video and I started talking to the detectives who were working on the case, and I found out pretty quickly that Max Tavita was in fact Hamish McLaren, and the extent of his crimes and what he had done. And that started the process essentially for me for unravelling the previous 18 months of my life, which had been completely fictitious, with this man who had told me lie after lie after lie, and in the process stolen my life savings. It took me nearly 18 months to fall in love with him, and then within 24 hours I had to fall out of love with him. It was like a death. I really had to get my head around very quickly the fact that this man that I was in love with in fact never existed. You know, how do you explain a non-compliant superannuation and a fraudulent criminal boyfriend to a 6-year-old? He got my phone number and he called me from jail. I'd never received a phone call from anyone in jail before.
Call's been recorded.
Call's been recorded. You accept it, you get 6 minutes. I mean, it certainly wasn't on my vision board growing up. I took the calls because I was so desperate for information. Babe, tea, you know, all of this. And I was just peppering him with questions because, you know, the police couldn't tell me anything. His family wouldn't talk to me. I had no answers. And so I thought maybe I could get the answers from him. What is your real name? What is your identity? Are your parents alive? What about your sister? Where did you live? What's this? What happened? Where is the money? It's just a name, T. Don't worry about a name. It's just a name. And I'm like, but it's your identity. It's who you said you were for the whole time we were together. I don't know who you are. Like, who are you?
The I Catch Killers podcast was a fresh start for me, as I left policing behind and started a new life. Over the years, we've laughed together, cried, and shared some powerful moments. Welcome to I Catch Killers.
Welcome back to part 2 of my chat with Tracy Hall. In part 1, Tracy talked about her life and how a person who called himself Max Tavita came into her life after her divorce. In part 2, we're going to discover pretty much everything that Max had told Tracy that led her to fall in love with him, become part of her life, was in fact a lie. Where we left part 1 was Tracy had been in a relationship with the person she knew as Max for about 18 months. She couldn't get in contact with him. She was worried about him. And then her good friend Kath contacted her and said, I think you need to have a look at this. At that point in time, Tracy looked at the link that Kath had sent to her and found that the love of her life, Max, had been arrested. And she then found out that he wasn't in fact Max. He was known by another name of Hamish McLaren. So, Tracy, welcome back to part 2.
Thanks.
I've just tried to abbreviate this story. I like the fact that you're laughing.
Yeah.
And we talked off mic that sometimes you just got to laugh at things because otherwise it just eats you up inside, and you just got to go, okay, well, this happened. Believe it or not, this is what happened. So you've got your life set up. What you thought was pointed in the perfect direction. You'd found love again. You had your beautiful daughter. You had your career going. Everything was tick, tick, tick. And then all of a sudden you find out that the person that had been in a relationship with for the past 18 months wasn't in fact that person. Do you want to take it from there?
Yeah, so I saw the video and started talking to the detectives who were working on the case, and I found out pretty quickly that Max Tavita was in fact Hamish McLaren.
Yep.
And the extent of his crimes and what he had done. And that started the process essentially for me for unravelling the previous 18 months of my life, which had been completely fictitious, with this man who had told me lie after lie after lie, and in the process stolen my life savings. So I was very quickly forced to fall out of love with him. It took me nearly 18 months to fall in love with him, and then within 24 hours I had to fall out of love with him.
Can we just break that down and we'll put the finances aside and the betrayal, but when we talk emotionally, like you don't fall in love overnight, you invest in love, it builds, and then for it to just cut off like that, it's painful for you, I would imagine.
It was like a death.
Yep.
And I've experienced grief associated with death before. And some of those emotions were incredibly familiar to me. And in some ways, that's the only way I could deal with it, because I really had to get my head around very quickly the fact that this man that I was in love with, in fact, never existed.
Yeah.
So to view him as dead in my mind was the only way I could cope with the fact that I'd been so horrendously deceived. And so that was one thing, but that comes with a lot of grief as well, because somebody who is so present in your life, that you talk to multiple times a day, that you're building a future with, that you very much see as part of, you know, the rest of your life, is suddenly gone, like they are when they die. And the grief around that was really odd, because I was grieving a relationship that wasn't a real relationship, but it felt real. And then I felt bad for grieving a relationship like that because he was a criminal. So it was just so complex and so multi-layered. And yet at the same time, I was, you know, having to face the fact that I'd given him my life savings and I was left with nothing apart from my income, my monthly income. And having to do all these very practical things like spending hours and hours with the investigators and the detectives putting my statement together, spending hours on the phone with the ATO talking to them about my non-compliant superannuation fund and what that was, working on a fraudulent tax return that he had done for me that may or may not have been fraudulent, I didn't know. And, you know, I did have some time off work. I had a very supportive employer at the time, but I couldn't lose my job. It was my only financial lifeline. And I had a huge job, a huge team. I had to get back to work. And so there were all of these kind of conflicting things that were going on in my life that I was having to deal with. And yeah, it's safe to say it took its toll.
What you just explained there, I can't even see how you cope with that. There were so many things going on in your life. And you've got your daughter, the impact that it has on her, and we'll talk about that later, how you broke the news to her, because he had become part of her life in his betrayal. So what was your priority to find out what happened to your finances? Was that your first priority?
It was really to deal with the detectives and the investigators, because they were putting this case together. So people were coming forward left, right and centre after the Crime Stoppers video. So it was really, that was a priority. And that took a lot of time and effort and energy, because exactly the way you were asking the question, tell me about your first date. They wanted to know everything right from the beginning. How did you meet? What day did you meet? When did you go on dates? Who paid for the dates? What did you eat on the dates? Where did you go then? What car? Do you remember the number plate? What text messages have you got that you can share with us? What documentation did he provide? What fraudulent reports did he give you? When did you give the money? Where are your bank statements? So much.
I like them. They're the exact questions that should be asked. But that takes time. That takes time, not just to sit down and actually type the statement or get the statement taken. It's getting all that information.
Yeah, and remembering and recalling and trawling back through emails and text messages and WhatsApp. And
the thing that saddens me, Tracy, and the person that you were relying on in your life at that time is no longer there, because he doesn't exist, and he's the person that's caused that.
That's right.
So the sense of betrayal.
Yeah. I mean, I was very much on my own at that point, and I knew to do it justice, I had to get all of that information, and I wanted to do the best job I could, because, you know, part of me was also thinking, if I get all this information, then maybe it will help to find the money.
Yeah.
And maybe I can work out what's actually happened. And, you know, obviously that, you know, we know now that there was no money returned. But at the time I was really trying to unpick what had happened, because what I believed was real for 18 months or 16 months was actually not. And so, and this is one thing, you know, really interesting thing about our brains is that we don't like unfinished stories. And so we either make up the ending, which I couldn't do because I didn't
have the pieces.
No, I didn't have the pieces. Or you live in this state of ambiguity where your brain cannot actually rest until you have this story compartmentalized and you have the full story. And because I couldn't get any answers, I could not rest. I could not sleep. I could not eat. I lost 6 kilos in 3 weeks, and I'm not a huge human, so that's a lot.
That's a lot.
And it was so discombobulating. Like, I just can't even sometimes describe how confused I was during that time. I was highly anxious because, I didn't know if he was going to get bail, and I didn't know if he was still in jail. Like, there was a lot going on. I became depressed because I was thinking about my future and how much I had lost, and, how I was going to make that back. And then, of course, life goes on, and you have a child that needs to get to school every day. You have a job that needs taking care of, and you somehow have to find the energy and the will to get out of bed and move forward. And all of that going on at the same time was just, it was a lot. It was a lot.
I just in awe of the fact that you got through it, because I'm sure there would have been times when you think, I just don't want to be here, but you've got your daughter and everything else going on in your life. Your dealings with the police, because they're the ones I would imagine that you will hope to get some answers or some understanding, because where else do you turn? In conversations I've had with you, you were very impressed by the police officers. We'll mention their names. It's credit where credit's due.
Yeah, the lead detective, Tom Zadravec, was incredible, very young.
Yep.
And he had come across this case. It had landed on his desk, and it was a reasonable amount of money, and he wanted to look into it. And I think from what I've learnt, and you might be able to give insight to this too, but fraud is very, very difficult. Not many coppers like to touch fraud because it's a lot of paperwork and it's complex, and it's quite hard to prove fraud because, in essence, people have freely given their money, under deceit, but given money. So it's quite hard to prove, I believe.
It's complex because quite often people come in and report something, and you look at it from a purely legalistic point of view, and you could say, well, it's a civil matter, it's a dispute between two parties, and it should be resolved civilly, therefore police have no position in there. But it sounds like you had a couple of young, highly motivated detectives that took the different view on it, and that it's something that should be explored. So full credit. But it can happen, and not critical of police. There is that ambiguity between, is it a civil matter or a criminal matter?
Yeah.
And I know as a young detective, quite often you got given a lot of frauds. That's where you cut your teeth or learnt your trade, and they are confusing. And quite often when they go to courts, you don't really think the punishment fits the crime. Like when someone's had their life savings taken from them, and we'll talk about other victims later on, it destroys their life. They've worked. You've worked 20 years. Your superannuation, everything, every hour you went to work, you were accumulating your superannuation, and that's just been taken from you. But I would imagine there was some low points where, did you have support network? I bet you Kath came on the scene, and I hope she didn't say, I told you so.
No, Kath would never say that. Yeah. And there were other friends that probably thought he was a little quirky as well. Yeah. But so no, I have a very tight group of girlfriends who just kind of rallied around me. I think Kath, stayed at my apartment for a few nights. She slept in my bed and she just held me, and so I had some incredible support. At this point, not very many people knew what had happened, and I wanted to keep that close because I didn't know what the outcome was going to be. Obviously, it was such a huge thing that had happened to me, and then you layer on all the embarrassment and shame and all of that stuff as well. I wasn't kind of prepared to talk about it broadly, so I did have a very close support network of people. But of course, when anything big happens, it's very acute and intense at the beginning, and people are very supportive, but then life goes on, and and that's just the way it works. And so I was sort of left to figure out what I was going to do. But you're right, there were some incredibly low points where I would wake up in the morning and remember what had happened and just think, I've got to do a whole nother day. And the thought of that, it just felt like this big grey heavy blanket just weighing really heavily on me, and I would have been quite happy to lie in bed all day and just cry. And we spoke about my daughter just before, but I made a decision very early on that there would be no tears at the dinner table.
Yeah.
And I wasn't going to tell her what happened. And that was another reason I kept it very quiet, because how do you explain a non-compliant superannuation and a fraudulent criminal boyfriend to a 6-year-old?
Well, I was going to ask that question. How he had become part of her life, or the person we knew as Max had become a part of her life. She would be asking questions. Well,
interestingly, she didn't.
Yeah.
And that's a funny story, talk about laughing. It was about 9 months after we were doing the shower routine at night, and she turns to me and she says, "Oh, Mum, we haven't heard from Max in a while." And I just thought, I said, "Nah, he's been really busy with work, sweetie. It's all good." And I just thought to myself silently, "You've done a good job, Trace. You've kept it from her,
Yeah.
And that was my intention back then, because obviously it's very difficult to describe what had happened. I didn't want her to worry.
Yeah.
Either about, him as a person, or the fact we didn't have any money or anything like that. She was so young. And I thought to myself in that moment, 9 months later, she'd never asked a question, because she didn't actually see him very often.
Right.
It was the odd holiday here and there, but on a week-to-week basis, he was just a guy on the phone.
Yeah.
And of course, she was at school all day. And this is the wonderful thing about children, is their life is the centre of their universe.
Yeah.
They don't give a shit about us,
Stuff you, Mum. I've made a new friend at school.
Yeah, that's it. And the fact that I think I just carried on was, and I think having something outside of yourself that's bigger than yourself is often the thing that gets you through.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you
And
make.
I didn't have a backstop at home. It's just me.
Yeah.
So who was going to make her lunch and get her to school and get her to activities if I was a mess in bed all day? No one. And I think that's what helped me through. And there were some other tricks that I learnt through my psychologist, that was, things like that moment when you wake up and you think, I can't get through another day.
Yeah.
You just break everything down into the smallest pieces, so that every time you achieve that small thing, you get a dopamine hit. So I go, okay, what do I need to do first? Okay, you just need to sit up and put your feet on the floor. I can do that. So I did that. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to get to the kitchen and make myself a cup of tea, because tea makes everything better in the morning. And I did that, and I went, oh, well done, Trace. Like you've got to the kitchen. And I know this sounds so banal, but it is literally breaking down my day like that.
Yeah.
And that's how I got through. And I think if I had have thought in the morning, okay, I've got to get up, get the kid to school, go run a team of people at eBay, deal with the MD, go do this, run a campaign, cash a bus home, get her from daycare, take her to activities, make dinner, do the homework. If I had have thought about that in the morning, I wouldn't have gotten out of bed.
But being overwhelmed.
And you have these little dopamine hits by doing the smallest things, that over time it gives you confidence that you can get through another day.
Yeah. Okay, it's interesting the way that you describe that, and I think a lot of people could take a lot away from that, those days that you wake up and you're just overwhelmed. Well, what's the first thing you got to do? You got to get out of bed, stupid.
Yeah, just sit up.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And just break it down.
Yeah.
So let's take it, say, two months after what's happened. He's in custody.
Yeah.
You still haven't got answers. You're confused. When do you start to realise you weren't his only victim?
To be honest, it wasn't for a very, very long time. I mean, I knew I wasn't the only victim. I knew they were working with a lot of victims, but the details surrounding that because it was illegal. It was a legal case, of course. So there wasn't a lot of information. There was just like comments like there are multiple victims. It's millions of dollars.
Yeah.
They're the sort of answers that I got. Obviously, I was busy trying to piece together who this man was by going into the internet. Now I had his real name, so I was doing a lot of that. And there were still some sort of things that I had to provide, like, dealing with the ATO and unwinding the
tax claim.
Yeah, the non-compliant super fund, all of those things. So those things went on for a long time. It wasn't until we went to the plea hearing, which I'm going to say was more than a year after he was arrested.
Yeah.
And not long after I met Greg Bearup.
Yep.
And
could we just so people understand who Greg Bearup is? He's a journalist, a very decent person. We both speak very highly of him. Award-winning journalist. We added that, Greg. He'd like that. But he was the person that did the Who the Hell is Hamish podcast. So when we're referring to Greg, that's who we're talking about.
Yeah. So he's actually really good mates with Kath.
Yeah.
And
that figures. I could the way you've described Kath, and I know Greg, I could imagine them getting on. They're good, curious minds.
Good buddies.
Yeah.
And Kath had encouraged me to meet Greg.
Yeah.
After this had happened, and I wasn't in a place emotionally or mentally to be able to do that. And so I didn't meet him for quite a long time. And then one day, about a year after Hamish was arrested, I woke up one morning and thought, I'm gonna go talk to Greg and see what he's got to say. And in meeting him and telling him my story, he was just, his eyes were wide open and his mouth was on the table and he just couldn't believe what had happened. And around the same time, Hamish's plea hearing was coming up.
Yep.
And at this point, we didn't know whether he was going to plead guilty or not. And Greg said to me, do you want me to come with you? And I said, yes, please. And Kath came, and I had another girlfriend come, and they were like the tiger mums around me. And of course, Greg was there with his notepad. He was so fascinated. Yeah. And we were the only people in the courtroom. Yeah,
that shocked you. I remember
it did.
How it was mentioned in the book that there was no.
The investigators weren't there. There was no family there. There were no other victims there. Now, I don't know whether they all knew what was going on.
We've caught the fact that you've mentioned that. I think victims are sometimes, or people involved in court matters, because there's processes that go through, and sometimes people that know courts know that there's not going to be a lot mentioned there. You're going to sit around all day, and it's going to take 2 minutes, and then the matter's heard. Did you get, before we get into the court matters and what he was charged with? I would imagine that was going. If I was in your situation, I'd be desperate to have a conversation going. 1,000 questions that you would have to ask of him. Is that what was going through your mind? Did you have questions, or is it almost you've cut it off? I'm not even interested in what he's got to say because I couldn't trust anything he's got to say.
Well, all of that.
Yeah.
But I did actually talk to him after he was arrested.
Talk us through that.
So I had multiple conversations with him. He got my phone number.
Yep.
And he called me from jail. And I'd never received a phone call from anyone in jail before.
Call's been recorded.
Call's been recorded. You accept it. You get 6 minutes. I mean, it certainly wasn't on my vision board growing up, but here I am. And I took the calls because I was so desperate for information. Yep. And this was in the first couple of months after he was arrested. And he called and he was sort of, very chummy with me, I guess. Babe, tea, all of this. And I was just peppering him with questions because, the police couldn't tell me anything. His family wouldn't talk to me. I had no answers. And so I thought maybe I could get the answers from him. What is your real name? What is your identity? Are your parents alive? What about your sister? Where did you live? What's this? What happened? Where is the money? I had so many questions for him. And he was just so offhandish with me, It's just a name, T. Don't worry about a name. It's just a name. And I'm like, but it's your identity. It's who you said you were for the whole time we were together. I don't know who you are. Like, who are you? It's just a name.
He's still conning you or trying to con you while he's in there.
Just no level of compassion or empathy.
Yeah.
And so these conversations, we had a few conversations over the time. Of course, I couldn't ring him. He would ring me. And I pretty quickly realised that I wasn't going to get anything from him that I could trust.
Yeah.
And then the letters started. So he sent me 5 letters over the time, and they were, musings about how tough things were for him in jail and how long it took him to get a pen and how none of the food was edible. And
poor baby.
I feel so sorry for him. And and then, a whole bunch of rambling memories about things that we had done to elicit a level of nostalgia, I guess, for me about those good times, like paddleboarding at Tamarama, and the times we spent in Byron, and what we ate, what we drank, like just memories, really. And then it moved on to him really encouraging me to go and see him and visit him. And I saw these communications, these letters and these phone calls as, it was like he was dangling a $317,000 carrot in front of my face.
Yeah.
And of course there was a part of me that wanted to go and see him and see if I could get that money back, because I'd lost everything. And but I quickly realized that there was absolutely no way that I could ever trust anything that came out of his mouth. And it was likely that it was all just going to be another lie. And so it was just a waste of time, just a big fat waste of time.
It sounds like an obvious thing to come to the realisation, but I can also understand why it would be harder to do than to... harder to just cut him off without at least trying to get answers. But it sounds like he was just still conning and manipulating and trying to control the narrative.
Yeah.
And that's the what I call it the sickening side of fraudsters, is that they've always got an excuse. They're always trying to manipulate, even when they're caught. You don't get them to... I don't know if it would have helped, but if he fell on his sword and said, look, I can't help it, they're just a con artist, you're better off forgetting about me, blah, 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 I'm sorry I deceived you. Some acknowledgement like that, but you got nothing like that.
No.
It's just a name. I don't know. Actually, he's got a point there. What are you on about, Tracy? What are you whinging about? It's just a name.
It's just a name,
yeah.
Don't worry.
Hamish, Max, whoever I feel like being that day.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've had the communications. I can imagine that. When did you start to see some light? Like, the world would have been pretty dark when it first happened. At what point did you say, okay, I'm making progress. I can see some light at the end of the tunnel?
To be honest, I think it was after the plea hearing that Greg came along too. So in getting back to that...
the charges. Okay.
Yes, so he pled guilty, which was great in a sense, because I knew then I wouldn't have to go through a court process and all of that. It just has some downsides as well. You don't get to make a victim impact statement.
True.
You don't get to face him head on. But in that session, they went through a document which was called the Statement of Facts.
Yep.
And we didn't, it wasn't spoken about in detail. It was quite legal. And Hamish was there. Hamish appeared that day. He came up from the bottom, and
Don't you mean Max?
Oh, well, I knew him as Hamish at that point.
Okay.
I know, it's always so confusing. Which we just interchange the names. But he came out from underneath, and he was sitting in that glass box, and he was flanked by two bodyguards, and he was in his prison greens. And I just kept staring at him. He wouldn't look at me. And I was flanked by my tiger moms and Greg. Yeah. And we went through that sitting and that hearing, and they talked about this document called the Statement of Facts. And afterwards, and he went away downstairs, the guards took him away. The DPP, who was acting on behalf of the victims, came up to me and said, I believe you're a victim. I'm really sorry about what's happened. I'll be acting on behalf of all of you. And I said, thank you. Is there a chance we can have a copy of that document? And there was a hesitation to give that to me. And then Greg flashed his journalist badge, and we had a copy in a hot minute, and we went across to a cafe opposite. And that is the moment where I realised the extent of what he had done. The other 15 victims were listed, how much money they had lost, under which circumstances they had lost them. And Greg and I just pored over this document. And that's when Greg said to me, this is a podcast. This is not an article in the Weekend Australian. This is a podcast. And that's where it started. And so Greg got the go-ahead to investigate for the better part of the next year and write the podcast, Who the Hell is Hamish? And as he was doing that, he would keep me informed, and he would tell me the things that he was finding out, or he'd come across a name and he said, have you have you heard this person? Who's this person? And I would give him my version of it if I'd heard of them, and he would put the pieces of the puzzle together. It was an investigative piece, of course. And so that is where the sky opened up for me, because I started to get answers.
Yeah.
And that unfinished story that I had in my head where I couldn't rest started to become clear. And Greg was the person that would call me and go, oh my God, guess what I just found out? He's got a wife. And Greg's got Greg as well. He's got a great sense of humour. He's very caring and compassionate, but he's really funny as well.
He's a very funny man.
So his sense of humour actually really resonates with me. He's got a wife. And I go, really? Oh, that's interesting. And, he'd tell me a bit about that and then that story. And I said, can you ask her if it's okay if I talk to her?
Yep.
He provided me with her phone number and we connected, and we've become firm friends through our shared experience. So I really believe that that's when it started happening for me. And knowing that there were other people in the case, people like Lisa Ho, businessmen, people that were far more probably business savvy than me, older, wiser, all of those things had also been fooled by him. And I think with anything in life, when you know that you're not alone, that other people have been through something similar and you can relate to them, then there's a level of comfort in that. Yeah. And I think that's where things started to improve for me.
That makes a lot of sense. And I would imagine from your point of view too, you would be sort of being hard with yourself, going, how could I be so stupid? Why did I let this happen? Am I the most stupid person in the world? And then you see the list of other people that have been conned by. I've just got a list here, and I've got it from your book, just to give a sense of it, and we can talk about any specific one. I've only mentioned the names that have been mentioned in your book, and there's some that are anonymous, but these are the other victims that have earned the amounts of money that they lost. Lisa Ho, $850,000. Glenn and Vicky Pickard, $607,000, $600. Karen Lowe, $950,000. A Sydney woman, $564,000. A triathlete, $428,000. A woman introduced to Hamish, $768,000. Surf shop co-owners, $33,000. A woman not identified, $1,019,000. A woman introduced to Hamish, $80,000. These are people's lives that have just been destroyed. Mm-hmm. And there was one an elderly couple that a person had to go back to work, and because that was their superannuation, that was their savings.
That's right.
Just do you want to just highlight one or two of the stories that to understand the impact that actions like Hamish have on people? I mean,
everyone was impacted in their own way, and I think even if you lose $10,000, that's a lot of money. Yeah. But some of these figures are huge, and the ones that I felt the deepest level of compassion and empathy for were the retirees. Yeah. Because in some aspects, I knew that I had another 25 years of working in me. I could make that money back. Mm. And these were people who had spent their whole lives working their clackers off. And they had worked hard. They were honest people. And they'd done well. They'd been clever with their money. They'd brought up children and grandchildren. And they were due to have a really lovely later life. And he took that away from them. And they don't have the ability to make up that money because they're not working anymore. Yeah. And, so to rectify those losses are very difficult for elderly people. We know that a lot of elderly people are being scammed. So those ones within the case were the hardest ones for me. And I got to know these people really well throughout this process, throughout the podcast and throughout the court process. And, the grandparents in the case that is been widely documented. The husband in that relationship had a work accident and had suffered a brain injury, and the money that Hamish took from them was part of his compensation payout. And he knew that money was coming to them and still took advantage of it. And they went from what was going to be a comfortable retirement supporting him to wondering how they were going to pay their groceries every week. Yeah. And they were the ones that hit me the hardest. relationship breakdowns because of the pressure. There was one couple and their relationship didn't survive. And that's sad. That's a 30-year marriage that's broken up by someone else's wrongdoing. But of course, there's a whole bunch of reasons that may have happened, but you can't deny the pressure that would have put it on the relationship. Yeah. So things like that really got to me because there's just not a lot of time for those people to rectify the financial losses.
Yeah. I think you took comfort in the fact and that you'd lost your finances, and someone, I'm not sure if it's someone that you were seeing helping you with advice or one of your friends, said that, okay, let's take stock of your life. You've got a beautiful daughter, you've got a great job, and you've got years where you can gain the money. Yeah. And you look at it that way.
100%. You have to.
Look at the positives.
Otherwise you stay in that really sad, depressed, anxious victim state where life is never going to get better if you stay there. Yeah. So you have to look at the things you do have. And I think, I talk a bit in the book about my trip to India after my dad died. Yeah. And one of the things that I draw on every day from that trip is these people who have nothing, yet are the happiest people you've ever met. Yeah. And, that was a really great life experience for me to, have a year doing that because, subsequently I've experienced a great deal of loss, and I draw on those people and their attitudes towards life who have nothing, and yet just have so much love and joy and family and all of those things, and they're having a great life. They're not thinking about what they've lost, they're just thinking about what they've got. So I draw on that a lot.
I think it's amazing that you can find solace in drawing from people like that, but I do understand where you're coming from, and the pity, not pity is not the right word, but the empathy that you have for the older victims that don't have a chance to rebuild and the impact it's had. And I'm not sure if the courts fully get it, the impact of fraud. Like, there'll be public outrage if someone's injured, and quite rightly so. Violence is a terrible thing, but if someone's been attacked, there's outrage. But when you look at the damage of fraud, when life savings, people that have worked their whole life and it's just been taken from them, what for? What was the motive? The motive was just pure greed on behalf of someone. Yep. Was it just a reaction where you've overreacted? No, this was a planned, deliberate action over a period of time to rip these people off and not care one bit about the consequences of your actions. The courts, tell us about the sentencing day. Your band of brothers and sisters gathered together?
We did. We all went, and we thought we were going to get an outcome on the first day. And the courtroom was full of people. It was full of media, which shocked the judge because I don't think he realised the extent of what he was, dealing with, and everything was recorded. And of course,
was this before had the podcast started at this stage? Okay, it's amazing the interest that gets with a little bit of media attention.
Yeah, and I think in this case, it was. I feel grateful that the Australian invested time, energy, money, Greg, in investigating this, because there's no way we would have found out, or I would have found out, the extent of the information that I'm now privy to because of Greg's investigation. And I think it did bring a level of interest into the public domain of this particular case, but of this type of fraud in general. And so the court was stacked full, and we went through the process, and it took a lot longer than I thought it would. And at the end of it, the judge said, I'm not going to rule today. I need some time. I need time to look at all this. It was a lot of information. There were a lot of victims. There was a lot of detail. Hamish chose not to speak, which is his right. But there was nothing from him other than a one-page letter of which part was read out by the judge, and he asked us to come back a week later. So I guess it was like a lot of sort of build up to no kind of outcome on that day, which was disappointing in a sense, but also to there was comfort in that because I knew that the judge was going to take some real time to look deeply. Spent a week doing that, and then we came back the next week to a different court. There was just as many media there. There were more people in the gallery. Yeah. And he gave his judgment. And to your point where, it's not always, this type of crime is not always sort of treated with the same level of seriousness of other crimes. I feel like in this case, the judge really, really took his time. He spent, I'm going to say, the better part of 2.5 hours reading out every victim, details surrounding every victim, how much they lost, under which circumstances, and really took his time to acknowledge each of the circumstances, which in the absence of being able to do a victim statement, a victim impact statement, or being able to talk or whatever, that felt...
you had someone speaking for you.
Yeah, it felt like there was some advocacy on our part. A lot of the victims were in the courtroom that day, and then he sentenced Hamish to 16 years.
Yep. Which
was one of the largest sentences given for white collar crime, this type of white collar crime in New South Wales, because we went in there with Tom and Chris and the detectives saying, it's probably going to be a couple of years. He'll probably get a couple of years. I think Greg was saying, if he got 5 or 6 years, that'd be a good outcome. So these were the numbers that we had in our head. Yeah. And of course, when 16 years was said, it was like, holy moly, like that's incredible. And then there was a parole period. I think it was a 12 years non-parole.
Yeah.
And he really, really gave the extent of his of his point of view about the deep impact that this type of crime has on our community. So that was great. But then, of course, it was appealed and the sentence was reduced to 12 years, right. 9 years.
9 years on the bottom.
Non-parole. And part of that reasoning was they felt that the judge was not impartial enough, too much on the side of the victims. Which, and the thing I've learned about the court process, it's very... technical.
Yeah.
There's no emotion. It's based on technicalities. It's based on what's happened in the past. It's based on these, there was a 25% discount on his sentence because he pleaded guilty. And it's like, what? I didn't even know these things existed. Like I've learnt a lot, of course, but things like that. And you think this is not about often what's right or wrong or the impact or the magnitude. This is based on technicalities.
Has any of the money been recovered? Like by pleading guilty, did he say, yes, this is where I've been funneling the funds and here there's...
No.
So, I have and it sounds like you have respect for the courts in that they took on board the detail that the judge that originally sentenced Hamish. But the question that I asked, from a layman's point of view, I'm forgetting myself of being a detective, from a layman's point of view. Okay, so that tallied up, it was millions of dollars that were fraudulently taken from people. It's pretty hard to spend millions of dollars in a short period of time, so therefore that cash has to be somewhere. We've got a bloke that's doing now 9 years jail, gets out. If we don't know where that money is, what's to suggest that he or, and this is me speculating, so I don't want to get ourselves into trouble, have access to that money that's never been recovered?
Well, I mean, I think the only person that knows the answer to those questions is Hamish.
Yeah.
As part of this case, it was, we were told that there was no money anywhere in Australia.
Right.
So they had investigated to a point where there was no money. They couldn't see any money sitting in any bank account anywhere. And I think this is the other thing that I've learned about, investigating fraud is that Tom's job and the police role is to arrest people like Hamish, prove that he has fraudulently deceived people and stolen money, and put him in jail for as long as period of time as possible, right? Tick. They did that, and they did a bloody good job. Their job is not to go find my money.
The recovering the money. No.
It's not. And they're not required to do that. They're not incentivized to do that. They may not have the technology, certainly stretch for resources, as we know. And so, you know, they did what they needed to do to get the outcome they got. And that's just the way the process works. But potentially had, you know, and this is another problem with people who've lost all their money to crime and fraud, is that we don't have the money to go and pay a private investigator to go trace, you know, offshore bank accounts or, you know, where that money could possibly be. And those private companies are probably the ones that do have the time and the skills and the resources and the ability to go and do that. But unfortunately, when you've lost all your money to crime like this, you don't have the funds to go pay someone. So it sort of ends there. But, I mean, he certainly didn't spend money the way that, you know, in line with what he had at his fingertips. Now, he could have used that money to go pay people off.
Yeah.
Maybe. I don't know. You'd think that would be able to be traced or seen. Could be offshore, or maybe he gambled it on the pokies down at the DYRSL. I mean, I don't know.
You just don't know.
You just don't know.
It's frustrating there, and I think a lot of people are surprised when they do report fraudulent crime to police. Think, great, the police are onto it now, we're going to get our money back. You articulated it very well. The role of the police is to establish whether an offence has been committed, and if it has, gather the evidence, present that evidence to the courts, and then the courts can decide. But it's not for if we can find where the funds have gone, it makes the case easier to prove. But if you can't, then you can still prove it without finding where the funds have gone. But is there a level of frustration that you have knowing that money's out there and just don't know where it is?
Well, I guess it's still an open question in my mind. Is it in fact out there? I suspect that it is, but I don't know that for sure. I have had to come to the point in my life where I've had to let that go.
Yeah.
So I came to a conclusion and a realisation and an acceptance that I would never get that money back.
Yeah.
Because I felt like the longer I stayed in a place of wandering and hoping and feeling like I had my hand held out, hoping that someone would give me that money back, it just felt like I was sort of still in that victim state, or at the mercy of what everyone else was doing to go and find it or whatever. So I just accepted that I would never get that money back, and I've chosen to spend my energy on rebuilding my finances, rebuilding myself, and making sure that I have a great life. And that's the only way I could deal with it.
Seems like a smart way to deal with it. Smart doesn't make it easy, but I understand where you're coming from. The fact that you're out speaking about it now on this podcast, your book, The Last Victim, and also the podcast. Who the hell is Hamish? Who the hell is Hamish? I forget. Is it Max or whatever? Hey, just before I go into that little spiel, was he using Max for all the other victims? Was that or was it just different names all over the place?
Well, mostly people knew him as Hamish. The other victims all knew him as Hamish.
Okay.
I was the only one that knew him as Max Tavita.
He must have thought you just needed to find a Max.
So special, aren't I? So special.
You've got a Max.
I think he was busy at that point in his life, early in 2016, building this new persona.
Yeah.
He's had multiple names over. I was reached out by a woman just last week who knew him when she was in her 20s, and he pretended to be a music producer. She was a singer, and she knew him as Hamish Hamilton. So, every day I hear a different story. Yeah. There's something else. But yeah, he was busy building this persona, and a woman locally who I know through a group of friends, she actually was friends with one of his nieces and growing up when they were young, and obviously knew him as Hamish and what have you. And in early 2016 was at a birthday party, 40th birthday party. Hamish was there, walked over to this group of people and introduced himself as Max. And this friend turned around and she goes, "Fuck off, Hamish. It's, Sally," or whatever it was. I'm not going to say her name, but And he, oh, yeah, and just brushed it off. And she never thought about it twice until the podcast came out and she met me. And she said he introduced himself as Max to me, and I knew him as Hamish from when I was 16.
Yeah.
So I think back then he was starting to build this new persona.
Yeah, getting it done. Hey, is his parents alive?
I believe they are.
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe they are.
Okay. It just adds to the layer of deceit, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, who lies about their parents dying? If you've had a parent die, you don't lie about that stuff.
That's the thing. You couldn't do it even if it served a purpose. You're not going to do that. Getting back to the question I was going to say, the fact that you've come out publicly speaking about this on the podcast with your book. How do you feel about that? Do you feel it's making you? Is it cathartic? And do you feel like you're giving people a heads up? Hey, look at me! It can happen to anyone.
Yeah, I think it's really important to tell these stories.
Yeah.
And I've come to terms with my story, and I talk about it publicly in corporate settings as well, because I'm so passionate about this not happening to anyone else. And I feel that if we talk about it, if we educate, there's so much shame around these stories that if they are kept in silence and in secret and in the dark, it's just going to keep happening.
Yeah.
And the more we talk about it, the more we educate, the more sort of resilient we're going to be, both financially and emotionally, as a community and as a society. And part of it for me is advocating on behalf of victims. So, I tell a story where there's this 75-year-old woman that I sat across the dinner table from, and her grown-up children were flanked either side of us. And she had heard my story and knew I was writing the book, had listened to the podcast, and she started telling me how she lost her divorce settlement when she was in her early 40s. The kids were probably pre-teens.
Yeah.
And she had not told anybody for 35 years.
Because of shame or embarrassment?
Shame, embarrassment. She didn't want to admit it had happened. The kids sort of knew bits and pieces, but she sat across the dinner table and she was crying. She was telling me this story, and I was thinking, that poor woman who has held on to that story for 35 years because she's so ashamed and she's so embarrassed, and she just wanted it to go away. And, it's stories like that just fuel my fire. And I think if we can talk about these things and release those feelings from someone, that's got to be doing something good as well. But mostly it's around education, around scams and fraud, because this is an extreme story. Most people will never, ever, ever experience anything like this. But we are all being targeted with scams and fraud every single day. They're getting more sophisticated with AI, with technology, with scammer farms in Southeast Asia. There is the likelihood that you or someone will lose money to a scam.
Yeah.
And so my purpose in life now is to educate people using my story as something to make people sit up and listen, and also to help people realize that it can happen to anyone.
Yeah.
And we just need to be more vigilant. We need to be more aware, and we need to help, become more resilient as a community.
Aware of it. I think a couple of points from what you just said about the victims coming forward and the shame. Like, I can't point out enough from a policing point of view. You guys are victims. There's nothing to be ashamed of. It's not. Shame doesn't come with being a victim. That's we should be able to put our hands up. I know where people are coming from. You don't want to feel like you were duped or stupid or that. But I think you out speaking the way that you do, it's clearly you're not some innocent person that could be easily manipulated or tricked, and it can happen to you. So an important thing that message comes across. Be aware of the scams. What advice would you give people? And as you said, your one with Max is an extreme. We're talking online dating, we're talking finances, we're talking everything. But would you look back and go, if there's something, that little instinct or something, that just go that little bit further and check if you've got a doubt, because there might be something there. Is that a
even
type
if you
of advice?
don't have an instinct? Because one of the things that I found really hard to reconcile with myself was that there was no part of my intuition that kicked in.
Yeah.
Sure, I thought he was quirky. There were some quirks, but I mean, who doesn't have a quirk in their 40s, plus a history and all of that sort of stuff. I think we can, yes, intuition. You think your intuition is going to kick in. Mine didn't.
Yeah.
And I always prided myself on having a really good intuition and being able to read people. So even if it doesn't kick in, I would say whenever you're thinking about, you're presented with information that has to do with, with money or, from a digital perspective, there are so many things you can do. So, there are resources online where you can just type in, e-toll scam, and you will see a bunch of articles come up if you're not sure. If you are unsure, don't click on the link.
Yeah.
I think we all know those. If you are approached for an investment, that's a bit of a red flag. You don't generally get calls out of the blue from your bank about the latest term deposit rate that they've got going.
Yeah.
Very, very rarely. If you are investing with a financial advisor, you can go onto the ASIC website and check that they've got the right credentials. You can check that they're able to advise you on, on superannuation, for example. You can also check if they've got a red mark against their name, if they've been banned, if there are any complaints. So there are places you can do. If you get an email, there are websites where you can do a domain lookup, and you can see when that domain was registered. So there was one recently, and the woman was approached by ING about a term deposit.
Yep.
And the URL and the email address that she got, I plugged that into this particular website. And the domain was only registered halfway through last year. Now, I'm pretty sure ING's been around longer than since June last year. So first red flag. Next one is that domain is registered to a country in the Caribbean that has no tax.
Yeah.
Triple red flag. So you start to look at, but it looks like it's ING. It's just a derivative of that in terms of the URL. Now, these are just some simple tips and tricks.
Practical tips.
Practical tips. Do a reverse image search.
Yeah.
There are some websites that are fantastic. If you put a photo in and it trawls the internet and finds the same person or that same picture, and then you can click on it and see what that article is about. So, there's those sort of things. If someone doesn't have a digital footprint, big red flag.
There's so many things that you just said there. I'm trying to, because I was a victim of fraud last Sunday. Woke up at 5 a.m. in the morning, text from the bank, is this your credit card? Blah, blah, blah. Had to cancel my credit card. It was someone accessing my account, and got it all cancelled, and then the reissuing of the credit cards and all that. Can strike anyone. The things that you just outlined there was about 20 points, all of which were very good. We need to put them. They're
on my website.
On your website, please.
Yeah.
I'm going to make a note because I need that type of advice. What's your website?
It's tracyhall.com.au.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Let's have a look there because they were so practical. I'm actually writing this down.
Yeah,
I am going to look.
I'll send you the document. There are so many things. There are so many resources. I think the hard thing, Gary, is that they just sit everywhere.
Yeah.
The banks are trying to do it. The insurance companies are trying to do it. We've got the National Anti-Scams Commission, which has been set up by the ACCC, which is doing wonderful work.
Yeah.
It's a big job to do, but there's all this information everywhere. There's scamwatch.gov.au, I think I've got it on the list. Yeah. But there are places you can go to educate yourself. There are places you can go to figure out what you need to do if you have been scammed.
Yeah.
The problem is it's in all of these different places, and it's quite hard to know
to stay on top of it because it continually evolves too. Yep. Because one scam's gone by the wayside, and then the next one comes in. So,
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
but we do need to apply that due diligence to what we're doing because we're all vulnerable to it, aren't we?
And vulnerability comes in so many ways. You don't have to be looking for love on the internet. There is research that says we are significantly more vulnerable after a major life event, so divorce, death, a major illness, or a natural disaster. And what they say is that we shouldn't be making any big decisions during those times because we are more vulnerable.
Yeah.
Now, they're commonly the times when you have to make the biggest decisions. Where am I going to live with the kids? How I've got to set up new bank accounts? How do I fund, my treatment or whatever it might be? And, it forced me to realise that vulnerability comes in those ways, but it also could be, you could have just had a baby and you haven't slept for 3 weeks, so you're tired. That's vulnerability. You could be a CEO travelling the world, going through different time zones and have jet lag. That's vulnerability.
Yeah.
And vulnerability is part of the human condition. We're not going to stop being vulnerable. And there's nothing wrong with being vulnerable.
Yeah.
It's just that these types of people and these types of scams prey on that vulnerability.
Yeah.
And that's where we have to be more vigilant and just be aware. And I think you're right, thinking critically about the information that's presented to you. And I have no problem saying that I didn't think critically enough.
Yeah.
I was just relieved that someone who I thought loved me was going to help me with something.
Yeah, and look, with Tracy, from the sense of betrayal, like when you bring the emotions into it, it's one thing to do the fraud scams. It's next level when you're doing putting you through the emotional trauma of what happened to you. And it's a sad place if we've all got to look out for that for every new relationship that's formed. But what happened to you could happen to anyone. So that's
I say be skeptical, not cynical.
That's a good
is
way
how
of looking
I
at it.
kind of look at it now. And people say, what advice are you going to give to your daughter and her friends as they make their way into the dating scene? And, it isn't get 100 points of ID. It isn't to go looking for all the red flags, because that's a very cynical place to live. It's a shitty world if that's what you're looking for. But it is to be more curious and more boldly. If you're not getting the answers you want, be like Kath, ask again, and be skeptical, but don't be cynical. And so that's, Hamish is operating at a top 1% of psychopathic offenders.
Yeah.
Like he's an outlier. Most people aren't like that. So you can't go looking for Hamishes in a world full of ordinary good people. So that's my advice, is just be skeptical.
Okay.
Not cynical.
All right, that's good advice. Your life now.
Yeah.
You're in a good place?
I'm in a great place.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm working hard. I'm obviously going around talking to a lot of corporates and educating people, advocating for victim support, obviously publicising the book. But yeah, I've made this my work now. This is what I do full time. And yeah, so it's great. I'm really enjoying it. It's a hustle. It's a challenge, but I feel like it's making an impact, which I'm really proud of.
Like the passion you got for it and the spring in your step, I can see it. So if there's one positive that's come out of this, it's the work that you're doing now. And I think it's great that you're able to articulate it so clearly and so specifically and personally, so people can look, well, it can happen to Tracy. It can happen to any of us. So great with the work that you've been done. The book, let's give the book a pitch. So it's The Last Victim. As you can see, I've got quite a few tags in there. Had a great read on the weekend. Spent my weekend reading it. And I was angry, I was happy, I was sad. It was all the things. And
all the feels.
Yeah. It was really a good read. Where can people get the book?
Online, through Amazon or your nearest bookstore. Obviously in bookstores, Big W is stocking them. Or you can get an audiobook through Spotify or Audible, and there's ebooks available as well. So whichever way you want to do it.
Great stuff. Well, thank you so much for coming on Eye Catch Killers and sharing your what I'm going to call incredible story, because it is a story from start to finish. I'm reading, go, no, that can't happen. But it has happened, and you've come out smiling, and that's great to see.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. What an impressive person Tracy Hall is. Now, if someone like Tracy can be a victim of a fraudster like Hamish McLaren, I think it shows that anyone could be. We all need to be careful, but the crime that was committed on Tracy was absolutely despicable. Not only stealing your love, but also your life savings. But there's a lesson for all of us that we all could be victims, and that was an important message, and such an impressive person, Tracy Hall.